Throughout Jesus' ministry, he had been hounded by the religious leaders. From the very beginning, they opposed him, and it wasn't long when they conspired to kill him. As early as Mark chapter 3, we read, "Then the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him." We remember from last week that these religious leaders were to be the spiritual gatekeepers. They were to be the vine dressers. They're supposed to be the stewards of God, to care for divine truth as revealed in the Old Testament. They were to be the shepherd of the people of God and the nation of Israel. And now we come to the final days leading up to Christ's crucifixion. After Jesus expelled the corruption from the temple on Monday, he returned on Wednesday, went to the temple to preach and teach the gospel there. And when he did, the members of the Sanhedrin came to confront him. It began when they questioned his authority in the temple, and it continued when Jesus used a parable about the wicked and murderous vine dressers to confront them of their failure to be stewards of God's vineyard. And as we come to verse 13, the three groups that make up the Sanhedrin tried to trap Jesus into making statements from which they could charge him with either something blasphemous or something political that could carry a death sentence. They wanted one of two things or both. They wanted to turn the people against Jesus because since Sunday he was massively popular and viewed as the Messiah. Or they needed to portray him as an insurrectionist to get the Romans to kill him. And in verses 13 to 17, the section that we're going to cover this morning, the Pharisees took a shot at him. Next week, we'll see verses 18 to 27, the Sadducees took their turn. And then in verses 28 to 34, it was the scribes. Obviously, you can tell that they pre-planned these efforts to come with these three waves. Perhaps they were hoping that it would only take the first wave, that of the Pharisees. But as we see these three groups, they are trying to pin Jesus down. They are trying to do this, but in reality, what they end up doing is they expose themselves. And so we will see here the stone-cold and hateful heart of the Pharisee as well as the tactics of false teachers. And notice with me, first of all, hypocrites and false teachers make awkward alliances against the truth. So Pastor Randy read this passage, so I won't read it all again, but look at verse 13 of chapter 12. Verse 13 says, "Then they sent to him some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to catch him in his words." Now the Pharisees came with the Herodians, and as noted previously in our look at the Gospel of Mark, these groups were political enemies. These two groups could not have been further apart in their worldview. They were two sects that coexisted in Israel, and they despised each other. The Pharisees were the most religious of all groups in the land, and the Herodians were the least religious. The Pharisees were most concerned with the Old Testament law, and the Herodians were most concerned with the laws of Rome. Herodians identified themselves with the Herodian family, the Herods. At this time, that was Herod Antipas. He was the governor of Galilee and Perea. This Herod was not even a Jew. He was Idumean, a people formerly known as the Edomites. He was a petty leader who had taken a piece of the kingdom of his father, Herod the Great, and he got his power by bowing down and pledging allegiance to Rome. So this unusual alliance conspired together to destroy Jesus. Their plan was to get Jesus to say something against Rome so that Rome would see him as an insurrectionist. Not only would that set Herod against them, but also Pontius Pilate, the governor placed in that area by Rome. The Romans were already aware of previous insurrectionists, and now they know how popular this man Jesus is, and they knew of his entry into Jerusalem on Sunday. If these groups could get Jesus to say something against Rome and against their Caesar, he would be viewed as a threat. He would be viewed as an insurrectionist. And what an unusual alliance it was. Of course, they also hope that by taking down Jesus, the people who at least since Sunday had been viewing him as the Messiah would also abandon him. If these groups can get him to say something against Caesar, he could be arrested, he could be tried. They also hope that the crowds abandon him. The idea of their view of a Messiah being arrested and killed was not what they would have perceived. And so another hope from these groups. We also see that hypocrites and false teachers will say and do anything to get what they want. Will you look at verse 14 now? Verse 14 says, "When they had come, they said to him, 'Teacher, we know that you are true and care about no one, for you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?'" Notice the flattery that they're using there. They called Jesus teacher. The use of that word in the original language is a term of honor. It would be used only for the respected rabbis. Certainly this was probably hard for the Pharisees to say because they wouldn't want to admit that this uneducated carpenter from Nazareth knew more than they. And of course they use lies. Notice now that they said to him, "We know that you are true and teach the way of God in truth." Did they believe that? No. They certainly didn't want to believe that. They had been painting him out to be a deceiver, a liar, a fraud who had to be stopped. He had to be silenced. And they only said this because at least since Sunday, the crowds believed those statements to be true about Jesus. The people had been calling Jesus teacher. And they were astonished, it says, in a number of places in this most recent section of the gospel. So they need to get the people on their side as well. So now they set Jesus up as a truth teller, in part to trick him into answering their question the way they wanted him to answer the question. So they called him a truth teller who didn't defer to anyone. Those words there, they're not meant to be an insult. What they're saying is that you tell the truth no matter what. And you don't defer to anyone. You're just a truth teller. And you don't worry about what anyone else would say or would think. See the setup there? Oh, truth teller, now tell us the truth. Because they are preconceived as to how he might answer their question. Notice also that hypocrites and false teachers discredit the truth. They didn't really want the truth out of Jesus. They wanted to discredit the truth. You see the enticement here to get the answer that they wanted, and then they could use that answer against Jesus. After saying you are true and you are truthful and you speak the way of truth, they wanted him to answer their question about whether it was lawful for the Jews to pay the poll tax to Caesar because they believed they could predict his answer. Now, do you remember the last time they asked him a question? The last time they asked him a question, Jesus said, I will answer your question, but first you answer mine. And we know that when Jesus got done answering their question, they could not answer his, and so he did not answer theirs. So that is what it is that they want to draw out from him. Really, what they're asking here, is it lawful by God's law? Is it lawful by God's law for the Jew to pay the poll tax to Caesar? What is in that question? What is the essence of that question? The essence of that question is, does the Old Testament law allow a Jew to pay taxes to an idolatrous Gentile with images of gods on their coins? The Pharisees believed that Jesus was going to say no. They had preconceived that the answer would be no. Now remember, there is a massive group of people that is listening to all of this. And these are people that have been following Jesus. Keep that in mind. If this question were asked to the people, those Jews in the temple listening to him teach and preach the gospel, if that question were posed to them, what would their answer be? Well, they hated Rome. They hated Roman rule. They hated Caesar. And they hated those who collected taxes for Rome. Surely Jesus would say no for both religious and political reasons. So the reason the Pharisees had the Herodians there is if they heard Jesus say no, don't pay the tax, they could report Jesus to the Roman governor in the area. That would be Pontius Pilate. And that leads me to our next point. Hypocrites and false teachers have no real desire for the truth. This is why they could make this unholy alliance with these diametrically opposed people, opposed to them in their beliefs and their ideas and their worldview. These hypocritical Pharisees, these really false teachers, have no desire for the truth. And so let's now look at Jesus' astonishing answer to the hypocrites and the false teachers. Of course, Jesus knew their evil plan. He knew their insincerity. In fact, Luke's gospel says he perceived their trickery. Matthew says he perceived their wickedness. And Jesus exposed them when he said, "Why do you test me?" Then Jesus said, "Bring me a denarius." Most Jews probably would not have had that coin with them, nor would the Pharisees have that coin with them. The Jews carried shekels, and this is how the priests were able to rob worshipers of their money through their outrageous exchange rates. This is what Jesus expelled from the temple just days before, right? And so this would not be a coin that Jews would probably carry with them regularly. Verse 16 says that they brought one, a denarius. Perhaps one of the Herodians had one. And Jesus said, as he had that coin in his hand, as he held it up, he looked at it and he said to them, "Whose inscription is this?" And everybody knew the answer. It's Caesar's. The Roman coin that was used during the time of Christ was the coin of Tiberius Caesar. He was the stepson of Augustus. On the front was the image of Tiberius Caesar with the inscription, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. Understand that Augustus was considered a god and Tiberius the son of a god. So do you understand the problem for the Jews? The coins were considered idols. They were graven images forbidden by Exodus 20. Most, again, wouldn't use them. They would pay the tax with their Hebrew coins. And because of this, it was expected that Jesus would denounce the coin and say the law of God forbids paying the tax with an image of a false god. If Jesus had said that, the Herodians then would report to the Roman authorities. This would be insurrection. Thus the reason for the unholy alliance, I call it. Well, as usual, they greatly underestimated Jesus. In verse 17, he said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's." In other words, pay the tax. Pay the tax that you owe. You owe the tax. But the most important thing that Jesus said was this, and to God the things that are God's. And so, of course, the full statement, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Here is the issue. While the Pharisees wanted to make an issue about having to give Caesar what he required, and attempting to paint Jesus as a revolutionary and an insurrectionist, they completely disregarded giving to God what they owed him. Think back to the parable of the vine dressers. And at the end of this particular confrontation, it says, and they marveled at him. These poor saps couldn't win. I think the marvel is two things. I think the Pharisees and perhaps the Herodians marveled that once again Jesus had escaped their trap. But I think the rest of the people who were in that temple, because they followed Jesus in there and were there to hear the preaching and teaching of the gospel, they too marveled at Jesus' words. And so, folks, as we consider this message and as we consider application for us, do you know hypocrisy when you see it? Do you know false teaching and false teachers when you see them and when you hear them? Jesus hates hypocrisy. Jesus hates phony religion. And may we cast all of that aside from our lives. Could we admit that probably every one of us have at least a little bit of hypocrisy in our lives? Let us cast all of that aside and be genuine in our faith and be genuine in our relationship with God and with each other. And as we conclude, I want to focus on that last statement that Jesus made. That statement is also for us. We are to render to God the things that are God's. You know, the false god Caesar had stamped his image on that coin. It was his. And the one true God has stamped his image on you. He created you in his image for his glory. You belong to him, and you owe him. You owe him everything. Christian, you owe the Son, Jesus Christ, your life as he gave his life for you. You also owe this, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. We owe Him that. And He alone is worthy of that. We owe Him submission and obedience. You belong to God. I belong to God. We need to make sure that our life reflects Jesus, His dear Son. We should seek to be more like Him. We owe Him honor and glory. 1 Corinthians 6 verse 20 says, "You were bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's." For the Father, that price was His only Son, who He gave to die for you. For Jesus, that price was His very life. As Brother Mike prayed this morning while we considered Christ's death on the cross, He was mocked for us. He was scourged. He was spit on. And He was killed for us. He freely bore our sin that we might receive the benefits of His life, His death, and His resurrection if we will place our faith and trust in Him alone. Romans 12, 1 and 2. If you can have favorite verses, they're mine. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Verse 1 tells us that it is our spiritual worship to present our bodies to Him as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to Him. Is that the testimony of your life? And know this Jesus is King, and we bow to Him as Savior and as Lord.